welcome to the Education Writers Association webinar, reporting on the child care cliff aftermath. I'm Kyra Miles. I'm the early childhood education reporter for NPR News in Minnesota. Previously, I was covering K-12 in Birmingham, Alabama, but I'm now covering young children and their caregivers. So I'm excited for this webinar, as I'm sure all of you are as well, to learn more about this topic. Before we begin, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, please drop them into the Q&A feature with your name and affiliation. You may ask your question at any time, and we'll get to them during the audience Q&A at the end. We will be putting the link to an evaluation survey at the end in the chat, so as well as a follow-up email. So please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps EWA improve. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and the video will be made available at ewa.org. All right, so the topic for today. On September 30th, the largest federal investment in childcare in history, more than $24 billion, expired. These investments didn't just help keep childcare providers open through the COVID-19 pandemic, but they also helped alleviate what experts refer to as long-standing market failures. Some state and local governments have worked to secure additional funding to avoid a fiscal cliff, while others have implemented budget cuts to childcare programs and subsidies. Across the nation, a recent analysis from the Century Foundation projected that as many as 70,000 programs could close as a result of the funding cliff, threatening to cut access to early care and education for almost 3.2 million children. To remain open, child care providers may have to serve fewer children, raise tuition, or cut wages. Today, we'll explore what the worst case scenario looks like and where we stand today, with help from our expert panelists, Miriam Calderon, Chief Policy Officer of 0 to 3, and Julie Cashin, Senior Fellow and Director for Women's Economic Justice at the Century Foundation. We'll dig into the broader implications of young learners' development and educational outcomes, connecting the dots between access to high-quality childcare and academic recovery in later grades. We'll explore how reporters can cover alarming situations in the face of incomprehensive data while contextualizing the story for their local communities. And we'll start first with a presentation from Julie.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be with everyone, and would look to, once you get my slides up, perfect. We can already move to the next slide. Thank you. So Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said childcare is a textbook example of a broken market. The rest of that quote, she goes on and says, one of the reasons is that when you pay for it, the price does not account for all the positive things it confers on our society. So, Kyra said it as a market failure, a broken market. That's kind of our starting point. And I think it's important to be really clear about that as a starting point. And it was a broken market long before the pandemic, before anyone had ever heard the words COVID-19. Half of all American families living in childcare deserts, communities where there's just not enough childcare for everyone who needs them. And childcare prices as much as rent, mortgage, public college tuition in many states. At the same time, early educators have long been paid poverty-level wages despite their complex and valuable work. So the stabilization funding that came through showed exactly what it could look like when one day we do actually make the robust investments at childcare that are needed. Providers are stable, families can rely on nurturing care, prices go down. Bryce Covert wrote about this in the American Prospect. She said, the money has done precisely what it promised, keeping providers' doors open and children enrolled. But it also did something else. It served as a test run for what it would look like if the federal government decided to make substantial ongoing investment in childcare and early childhood education. And it proved that such an investment would work. Over time, the end of those funds is going to lead to major destabilization. We're going to see, as Kyra said, higher prices, staffing shortages, and program closures. Parents will be left with tough choices and few options. We've already seen 42 providers close in Wisconsin. And the ARPA funds were not intended to address the broken market and the historic underinvestment. So that needs to be clear, right? We still lost more than 16,000 programs during the pandemic, even while these funds reached 220,000 and helped them to stay open. The sector is still in crisis with those high costs for parents, continued turnover in the workforce, and large shares of providers considering leaving their jobs. The sector is still nearly 40,000 jobs short of pre-pandemic levels. And meanwhile, wages in other sectors, other low-wage sectors especially, have risen faster than wages in childcare. So in food services, we've seen almost 8% increases, while the wages in childcare increases have been temporary, and it's been more like 3%, according to a study by the National Women's Law Center. Another consequence of the historic undervaluing of childcare is that we don't have great data. But when we thought about the fact that the stabilization grants are going to end, right, when we started to think about that in the spring, my Century Foundation colleagues, Laura Valle Gutierrez, Leah Woods, and I partnered with Research to Impact's Jessica Milley, an economist, to project what we could about the effects that the cliff will have in the United States. On the next slide. Using data from the Administration of Children and Families and survey data from 12,000 providers on the impact of those funds from the National Association for the Education of Young Children, we project that when the funds expired, that 3.2 million children could lose their childcare slots. And that's a result of the combination of higher prices, program closures, and staffing shortages growing. We estimated on the next slide that millions of parents could be impacted, likely leaving the workforce or reducing their hours to the tune of $9 billion a year in lost earnings, that the losses in tax revenue and business revenue could cost states a total of $10.6 billion in economic activity a year, and that the childcare workforce could lose another 232,000 jobs. The next slide. We also did state by state estimates. So we were able to look state by state using the data we had to be able to tell a story of what we project to happen in every state. And I think one of the things that's important to know is that while the end of the federal funds was abrupt, the impact will be felt more like a steady drip, a slow roll, or a quicksand, right? Like a slow moving, right? So first, providers will be forced to raise tuition prices. And we're already seeing this. We've heard of Christina Eubanks in Anchorage, Alaska, who raised her fees 23%, and Angela Schmitz in Wisconsin, who raised them 10% and is about to raise them again another 10% in January. Then we're also going to see, and already starting to see, these staffing shortages, like in Missoula, Missouri, where Wild Wonders home-based childcare program lost its 3 employees. So they went from serving 12 children to now 4 children. And that's just one of many that are going to have to contract. And then ultimately, providers will fight as hard as they can to stay open, but ultimately we expect that as many as 70,000 could close down. So I will leave it at that. We'll hold my other slide for a Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Miriam's connections to what this means for child well-being.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, Miriam, we know that your team at 0 to 3 has been paying close attention to the fallout from expiring pandemic-era policies like federal support for childcare centers and the expanded national child tax credit. Are we beginning to see this impact or see the impact that this will have on children's learning and development, and how it connects to what we already know about the science of early learning and brain development in the first few years of a child's life?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Kyra, for having me and for really hosting this important conversation. And I just want to also give a shout out to my colleague, Julie, for doing this really, really important work and research for the field. It's just been hugely important, and it's a really great partner. So love being here with her. We often really focus on and talk about high quality early care and education is really having, two generation benefits, and really think about it as a key support for families, in that it is, it helps families work, and that really is critical. It is, for families to be able to meet their material needs, provide for their child, build, their financial well-being and stability, to be able to advance in their own personal, educational, job, and career goals. And the fact that it is also really important and impactful for young children's healthy development, and learning. And these years, particularly the first earliest years of life, are a time of, rapid brain development. We often talk about this as the most consequential period in human development. The architecture of our brains are literally being built during this time. And that is really, and the way that our brains are forming are really built around our relationships and the connections we make, and the experiences. And we're learning everywhere, right? There's not, babies are born and learning in all the places that they are, and with the most, important adults in their lives and in the context of those relationships and interactions. And those include these very important relationships and environments with caregivers and providers, and in these childcare environments. And so I wanted to sort of, to really just talk for a moment about what does it look like to really be able to realize, I think, the power of these earliest years, and the power of what we know is high quality early care and education, which is a term I think we hear a lot: quality child care, quality early care and education. First and foremost, it's really thinking about, quality in these environments. It really starts with the caregivers themselves, the early educators, and their knowledge and skill about child development, their own well-being, and their ability to really be able to provide that nurturing and responsive care, form those close connections and relationships with the child, and with the family. So we all know that for the family and the parents, often this relationship with their child's caregiver is a critically important one. It is one really built around trust. It is often a really important resource for a family in terms of understanding about their child's development, right? And the experiences that they're having. So that's an important partner, and together being able to monitor and assess child development. It's often and can be also an important resource for being able to link to other resources and supports, right? To be able to monitor child development. It can be also a place where, for some families, you get access to nutritious meals. Again, you can get information about other developmental supports in the community. So again, that's really critically important. For the child as well, the early educator in these environments, the early educator and childcare settings create really intentional experiences for play, to develop physically, and to develop language, to develop social emotional skills. They're environments where children can interact with children of their own age, but also children of other ages and mixed age groups, which is also really fantastic for children's development. We know during this time, children are also developing and forming a lot around their identity. And so culturally responsive care is really important. So they're learning about their own identity, often in relation to other identities. So it can be a place where they're getting exposed to differences, and that is important for understanding who they are. And we know that 1/3 of young children, for example, speak languages other than English as their home language. And so early educators often are doing work to support multilingual development or development in more than one language. I think this is a really important distinction from the K-12 system, because often we know that many early educators as well are more linguistically diverse than K-12 educators. And so that is happening. Often we see more language matching between in the early education context, in the childcare context. And so that kind of support is important. And we know bilingualism has many benefits for development as well. So these are really important, again, assets. And then I just want to say, again, for families as well, there are also benefits, again, around, when these programs are affordable and accessible. That is also another really important consideration when we think about what does this need to look like. So it should not and cannot be the highest expense for families. We know that then will create a lot of other very difficult trade-offs for families. It has to be logistically feasible, right? So distance, scheduling needs, options, family preferences will really, are really important as well. So what families want sometimes for their 2-month-old looks very different than what they want for their 15-month-old or their 14 or their 4-year-old, right? And so options, also a lot of options and choice matters a lot in the community. And, a lot of the challenges and things that Julie just outlined here are going to at the heart of a lot of what we want to be true in this system, to be able to realize all of these impacts. And that's, just in wrapping up as we'll all close, when these things are in place, what I described, right, in terms of these opportunities and these 2-generation benefit, we know that we set a really strong foundation that shows up later in terms of, for children, in terms of long-term academic success, benefits and health that last, that show up well into the, K-12 system, greater likelihood of success in school, higher graduation rates, success in 3rd grade and beyond. Also in, health, I mean, but good, success in the early years shows up in terms of health benefits as well. Chronic disease, many studies, bear this out. And these kind of benefits have, benefits for society as a whole as well. And there's reams and reams of economic data and economists that have shown the return on investment. And I'm sure many folks are familiar with those studies. And then, Julie is one of the folks who has done a lot of research, as others have as well, around the impacts, of women's participation in the labor force, impacts to businesses and our economy when we can fully realize the benefits for families of child care and economic, being able to stay in the labor force. So again, 2-generation benefits, but again, it's got to be a system to fully realize this that looks a very particular way. And we are far from that, and we were not where we needed to be before COVID, and we are not certainly headed in the right direction right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Julie and Miriam, for those overviews. Miriam, I did want to say that I was at the 0 to 3 national conference last month, and that was really enlightening. So I appreciate 0 to 3 putting that together and allowing me to come to that. But now that we've gotten that overview about how the child care cliff could potentially impact providers and the children they serve, I want to backtrack and provide some more context for reporters seeking to localize the story. This is kind of why we come to these webinars. So I want to pose the question to both of you. What questions should journalists ask? What data do they need to obtain in order to capture what's happening in their respective communities regarding the child care cliff?
Good.
Great you go first, Julie. Yeah.
I'll get us started. I think I've really been heartened to see the vast media coverage of the cliff and the concerns about it. And I've seen a lot of reporters doing an amazing job of finding the providers to talk to about it. And, one of the things I think that's important to know, and I noted this, is that these our projections about closures are not going to be immediate, right? Childcare providers are folks who do this work because they love kids, because they want to serve their communities, because they know how much the parents in their communities need them so they can go to work, right? So folks are not eager to, close down. They're going to do everything they can to stay open. So our projections are longer term. It's not tomorrow, it's over time. So if you're going and asking providers like, oh, are you going to shut down tomorrow? Number one, they're not necessarily going to tell a reporter that I'm going to shut down tomorrow, right? Because they want to deal with that appropriately for the parents that they're working with. And they might not be because they're trying to figure it out. So I think asking more general questions about, how did this money help? Right? What were you able to do differently with this money? And I know what we're hearing, from the stabilization dollars is that a lot of folks were able to raise wages, and that was key. When you think about quality education, one of the number one things you should think about is quality jobs for the teachers, right? If you are paying teachers really well, then they can be economically secure. They're going to stay there. They're going to develop that consistent relationship with the children that they serve, right? So ask about how stabilization dollars were used. Were they used to invest in early educators? What difference did that make? How did it feel different in terms of retaining folks, in terms of recruiting folks, and in terms of people just feeling more stable in their lives by not making only $12 an hour with no health insurance, right? How did that change things for people? So I think that's a really important question to ask. And then what do you think the consequences of no longer having that money are? And then I think additionally, one thing that's sometimes hard is to imagine how different life could be, right? I spend a lot of time dreaming of the day when we do the significant investments in childcare that are actually needed. But sometimes when you're in the day-to-day of this work, it's really hard to dream. But this money gave providers a chance to dream, right? To feel this is what it could be like. I don't have to go into personal debt to do this work. I can actually feel stable and then focus on what I'm serving with these, how I'm serving these kids, how I'm serving the community. So, asking questions about just the experience and then finding parents to talk to about their experiences. Most parents will tell you it is hard to find childcare. And if they do find it, it's hard to afford, right? Like that is a very common story, whether you're low income or middle class. And so getting parents to share what their experiences have been, how it affects their work. Did they have to turn down a promotion? Did they have to change their hours? We know, we hear stories of folks who are tag team parenting, where somebody works in the day and someone works in the night. And, they don't actually spend time together as a family, but they're somehow covering childcare and their rent or their mortgage, right? So, what are these experiences that go beyond the numbers, right? That help us to see and feel the experience of what it's like to be a provider, to be a parent. And I have so much more to say, but I want to hear what Miriam has to say.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I think I agree with so much. I'll just sort of build on that. I think it is really important, I think as Julie was saying, that, we continue to really lift up the voices of families and providers. First, I'll say, start with families. We've done some polling and with families of parents, parents of infants and toddlers. I think some things that we, are continuing to be interesting to us is, through these polls and the engagement we have with families who are advocates on this issue and many other issues is that, they really believe that the government and our elected officials really should prioritize this issue, should make more investments, that they are responsible for fixing the childcare crisis. And so I think that, and this is, parents who are, red states, blue states, both sides of the aisle. And so I think that it is really important to continue to lift up their voices and that perspective, because, I almost half expected, some of the results back, even from some of those polls, to say, well, I think they're feeling like they're responsible, or, you know, the childcare provider down the street is responsible, right? When you see the impact of some of these closures. And I think this is a significant shift, right? That they are saying, government, our elected leaders have to do more to solve this. And so I think we really need to really hear more and lift up more of families and that message. I also think we're going to see families continuing, unfortunately, to make a lot of trade-offs, around with this issue as they experience a, much more challenging and difficult childcare market. And this is locally, right? There will be a lot of differences, even within the same state, because childcare markets are so local. And so, example, okay, I was able to get into the seat. It's more than this childcare slot, it's more than I can afford. We've had families that say that means I buy less nutritious food. I keep my thermostat down, right? Those are going to be a lot of the trade-offs we know. Unfortunately, we're going to continue to see, and we have to, be able to continue to center again those stories. I think, again, for early educators, we, in the State of Babies Yearbook Report, we, through a partnership with the Rapid Survey at Stanford, we were able to talk about, again, the stress, the burnout that early educators are experiencing, continue to experience. That those stories, again, link to what that means, and especially in terms of what I talked about, what we want to be true, right, in terms of quality care and the experiences for children and families, right? That means turnover, lack of retention, early educators being stressed has impact on the nurturing and responsive caregiving, the continuity of care. Those have impacts on children's development and learning. We need to be able to continue to really tell those stories. Want to say something, again, pretty positive. I also think we're seeing innovations locally in terms of solutions. They won't solve the problems long term, but I think there are ways in which I'd love to see stories about where we are, where we are seeing innovation, because there's a lot more attention to this, to this issue and this challenge. And that means, more great minds and more people rolling up their sleeves and doing things locally. And then last point I'll make is that this is one of many needs that young families with young children have, and one very important thing among others that we have to do as a nation to make this a more fair and a better country to have a baby and raise a baby. So I think really being able to also connect with the multitude of other factors that families with young children are facing right now that we are not delivering on, right? Like and we talked about this in the State of Babies report this year, expiration of the child tax credit, housing costs, right? The fact that we don't have paid family leave, economic insecurity for families with young children. These all compound together, a maternal health crisis, right? Challenges with increasingly with getting prenatal care in this country. I mean, a whole host of issues, right, that are just layering on top of families, right, are other ways to, I think, connect this crisis with many others that families with young children are facing.
I want to go back to when we're talking about solutions, because anecdotally it seems that there are providers who are trying to find solutions to avoid shutting down their services altogether. We've heard reports that some providers are opting to slash their own salaries so they can maintain current wages for their staff, while others are implementing tuition increases, as Julie mentioned earlier. Is there data out there yet that captures national trends and how early childhood educators plan to respond to the funding cliff, or what have you all been hearing?
I can get us started. Just, one piece of data that we do have is there's price data that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it did show that, once again, the month-to-month increase in childcare prices exceeded inflation, and it exceeded the increase in cost for other goods. And it also was the highest it has been all year. So we know that, that's national trend data that shows, and we'll be tracking, that comes out on a monthly basis. So we'll be tracking that on a monthly basis to see what story that tells. In addition, our friends at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, as well as the Rapid EC survey out of University of Oregon, right? And Stanford, is it both?
It's Stanford now, yeah.
Okay, out of Stanford, has a survey in the field right now to get more data from providers. And our friends at Community Change Makers also have a survey in the field where they're getting data from providers and parents. So there are a few different folks who are getting data. That data won't be available right away, but it hopefully will be available soon. I will note one other thing though, which is that we are hearing from providers, look, during the pandemic, I did forego a salary. During the pandemic, I did go into personal debt. Now I've gotten the stabilization fund. I've seen that it doesn't have to be this way, that we don't have to balance our lives on the backs of disproportionately women of color, right? That we can actually do things differently. And I'm not willing to do it again. So, it shouldn't have to be that way. Sociologist Jessica Calerco has said, like, other nations have safety nets, social safety nets. The United States has women. Like, that should be unacceptable. The fact that we were able to solve this temporarily suggests it doesn't have to be this way. And so, I don't know that we're going to see quite as much of folks willing to kind of eat it themselves and take it on themselves, nor should they.
Do you have anything to add to that, Miriam?
Yeah, that was great. I would just say, again, thinking, locally, there are a number of, intermediary organizations that are really closely connected to, early educators and providers that could capture, again, more of that local perspective. So really thinking about maybe our, labor partners, who represent childcare workers, staff, childcare resource and referral entities locally, maybe another good resource, other sort of, associations, may be also good resources to capture more of that local perspective.
Thank y'all for that. Julie, I have a question for you and the data coming from the Century Foundation about the survey from the 12,000 early childhood educators, asking if they would have closed during the pandemic if it weren't for the relief funds. Has anything significantly changed in the time since, whether on a federal, state, or local level, that makes you hopeful that this worst case scenario of 70,000 closures, 3.2 million children out of childcare, to make it that won't be realized?
I'm an optimist by nature, so I love this question. Number one, over 100 members of Congress have stood up and said, we want to do something about this. We want to pass emergency childcare funding. They've introduced the Child Care Stabilization Act that would provide $16 billion a year for 5 years as a way to move that forward. If that, that bill is, probably not going to move forward on its own, as legislation doesn't tend to do that. But the hope is that that funding could be included in an end of year package or some sort of a supplemental package. Of course, the House of Representatives has to have leadership first, but putting that aside, once they figure that out, I do think there's some possibility that Congress could act, and they should act on this in the short term. In addition, when we did our analysis, state legislative sessions had not yet wrapped up. They have since wrapped up. And what we're seeing is that forward-looking states, red and blue states, have invested their own state budgets to mitigate the impact. So Alaska, Kentucky, Maine, and Minnesota are a few of the states that have put their own dollars into operating grants, to workforce grants, and to other forms, right? So just to note that the American Rescue Plan was the first time funding went directly to states to then be given to providers directly. It was a really thoughtful supply side, investment. And so these states have kind of followed on that and been able to do similar supply side investments that really help make sure that, you've got a sector in place. So if you want to think about lowering costs for families, you have to have a sector in place, right? You could give somebody a voucher, you could give someone a tax credit, but if there's no childcare for them to go to, it does not matter. So actually making sure there's childcare in place is huge, and making sure that there's enough money there to pay early educators more money. So we are seeing this, and it's about 15 or so states that have made these kinds of investments. Other states have also invested in pre-K or in the childcare subsidy program expansions. So, there has been, and I do believe this is more progress among states than we've seen historically. So we are in this moment where there is a move forward. I will say, however, that if you talk to those state administrators, for example, in New Mexico, where they have a constitutional amendment now for $150 million a year to childcare and early learning, that even, the administrators there would say, we still need federal dollars. It's still not enough to serve all of our children and to make sure that we're paying living wages, but it's a huge and important step.
Would you say, like, we see these stats, 70,000 closures and 3.2 million children might be losing childcare, and those are scary statistics. Get plan to engage action. But how would you advise reporters to navigate that kind of confusing or unclear data that informs the worst case scenario projections without creating fear or panic? I mean, you mentioned looking at what their state legislator might be doing, or do you have any other advice?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a balance, right? Congress pays attention to things that are scary. Like, I wish that wasn't the way of the world, but it is. And so, it is helpful for folks to know that this is a possibility, and it's a real possibility. And I think that telling that story is important. However, I think it also needs to have that nuance, right? As I said, the end of the funding is abrupt. The cliff is about the end of the funding, but the impact of the end of the funding is not abrupt. The impact is going to be felt slowly and over time, and it's not a foregone conclusion. There's still action that can be taken. So I think, balancing the story to make it clear, like, this is a big deal. And if this is what happens, there are a lot of consequences that are going to be faced around the country, and it will happen over time. And Congress can still do something about it. And so also focusing on the accountability around that policymakers have something they could do about this, and asking them what they're going to do about it, what their plans are. I think that's helpful too.
Question for Miriam. You once said that childcare is a two-generation benefit, but that media coverage tends to disproportionately focus on parents and families and how they're affected. What stories would you hope to see education reporters tell in order to produce more balanced media coverage?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kyra. I know I realized I said it again today. Yeah, and I think when we were together, I was making the point that during the pandemic, and I was running the early learning system for the state of Oregon, I was noticing that a lot of the stories about K-12 school closures were about learning loss, and a lot of the stories about childcare closures were about adults not being able to work. And in K-12, when schools were closed, adults also weren't able to work. And when childcare was closed, children were also missing out on learning and developmental opportunities. So I thought both systems were both and. So yeah, I think I would love to see stories maybe that are getting the perspective of early educators, maybe kindergarten teachers, right, in terms of what they're seeing in terms of the needs of children who have missed out on some of these opportunities, right, to have a consistent, stable, high quality early education, early care and education experiences, and what they're doing now and sort of what those needs are. I think again, pediatricians as well have also an important perspective, child health providers, really to be able, is one idea, maybe to really be able to kind of elevate those issues. I think what supports maybe what is happening in communities, what are families needing and feeling in terms of, addressing supports in terms of their own concerns and stress, right, around as they're dealing with not being able to find this type of care. We know from some of the data that we're looking at, again, and we talked about and highlighted in SOBI when we talked about infant and early childhood, mental health. We continue to see families, talking about and reporting higher levels of stress. Again, a childcare system that is inadequate, and with a lot of these other compounding factors that I was talking about earlier, right, kind of create this sort of stress. And what we see is these higher levels of stress or loneliness that families continue to report. And then we see that in reports of children's behaviors, right, and externalizing behaviors continuing to remain high. And so, again, childcare, other supports in early childhood for family supports, right, to address this stress, right, is really critical both for the child and the family. And so, again, childcare is a great early education. That system is a great place to be able to connect those services. And so I think really being able to maybe highlight some of those pieces, those stories, I think is important. Another point I'd be remiss to not mention and wrap up as we think about, where to go with some of these stories is children, the identification of developmental delays and disabilities. I think that's something that we saw decline during the pandemic, and is of huge concern, right? Developmental screenings happening, children not being identified early enough, and then being able to get those services. That has consequences, are significant consequences for children, families, the K-12 system later on, if we're not able to identify children earlier and get them services. And that was, again, disruptions in care and childcare, as well as access to, pediatrics and children being isolated. But, as we come out of that, there needs to be more attention to what are we doing really to be able to get more services to children who missed out on that, and more supports, as well as strengthen that system going forward, because the children are needing those services now that they missed out on, and the systems and supports are still being challenged and stressed. So I think there's a lot to cover there, both from a, how do we how do we respond for children who missed out on things, and also, how do we make sure that these supports are strengthened going forward, because it wasn't where it needed to be to begin with, even before COVID. So hopefully that was helpful, but yeah, it's a bigger story for sure than important story about being able to support families and working, but it's also about making sure that children get access to learning and development experiences as well.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. So y'all, we're about to move to the audience Q&A. So please, if you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A feature, and please include your name and affiliation. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I had one more question for you all. I have the privilege of being able to focus on early childhood as my beat, and that's what I'm looking at, early care and learning. But could you share some ideas for K through 12 reporters about how to integrate early care and learning and childcare into their beat reporting?
Want to go first, Julie? Or?
Go for it.
Yeah. Again, one is, I think that the K-12 system is an important part of the early care and education system. And I think that that's one part of, what we don't often think about it that way when we talk about it. We talk about it as separate systems. And, I just was talking about, for example, children and the system that provides supports for children with developmental delays and disabilities. The K-12 system, particularly for preschool age children who need special education services, K-12 is an important, is the provider often in communities of those services. We know K-12 does a lot, it, often provides a lot in terms of preschool education. But it's important, that we think more expansively about, and I think in terms of coverage, what K-12 is offering, not just within their own walls and their own building, right? But what, particularly at this time when the childcare system is so under-resourced, and there are workforce shortages that we talk about them as part of this bigger early care and education system in a community. They are a provider. They have services that they deliver directly and staff. But they are also part of this bigger system. And, I love to see stories where we highlight partnerships, right? How they are maybe helping with some of these workforce shortage strategies, like as they deal with their own K-12 workforce shortages, right? Are there ways that they could partner and think about K-12, the early educator workforce needs too, and those solutions could be, joint, or how they have partnerships, maybe co-locating facilities, or how they support, families being able to find and locate care and all of the options that are available to them in a community. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but I think partnerships where they're connecting with other providers, really trying to see them as one source of delivery of early care and education, but also part of this, the mix of all these other providers and how they support the bigger needs that children and families have for early care and education that's responsive to the hours that they need of care and all of that, because it takes more than one provider, one system like K-12 to really be able to, I think, deliver that year-round full day care, meet the options that families need. And K-12 has a lot to do with that. And last point I'll make is a lot at stake too, right? Because if K-12 cannot do this alone, particularly close those gaps that we see by race and income in the K-12 system without a really, really strong birth to 5 system. So they have a lot at stake in the success of a birth to 5 system. We want them to see themselves as a part of that system too.
I have 3 quick additional thoughts. I totally ditto to everything. One is that a lot of teachers are parents and need childcare, and so our teacher shortages are directly connected to our childcare shortages. And we have a report that we did on that at the Century Foundation that we can share. 2 is that we know that kids do better in school when their parents are economically secure. So again, having childcare for younger siblings matters. Also, we know that older siblings sometimes end up watching younger siblings, so that impacts children's ability to succeed in school. And then finally, our shared interest in making sure that children thrive shouldn't start when they turn 5, right? And so we are totally comfortable, or many of us are, with the idea of paying the full freight of a 3rd grader's education. We pay for the building, we pay for the salaries of the teachers, we make sure they have benefits, right? But we are not doing that for childcare. So being able to really think through, why is that different? Why do we treat that differently? And should we treat that differently? I think is a really important question that folks who are steeped in the K-12 space may be able to shine some light on.
Thank you all for answering that. I want to take some questions from the audience. One is from Liz Bell, who's the early childhood education reporter with ednc.org in North Carolina. Liz says, this is a question for Julie. Could you please get a little more specific on how you came up with the projected numbers and closures state by state? Is this measuring licensed programs, and how long will it take for those numbers to be a reality?
Thank you. That's a great question. So we use 2 national data sources. So one was the Administration on Children and Families. They had information about how many providers per state received childcare grants, stabilization grants, and how many children were impacted as a result of that by state. So that was our part one. Part two was using the National Association for the Education of Young Children report, where they did a survey of 12,000 providers, and they have state-by-state data there. And in their state-by-state data, they asked the question, how would you have closed were it not for these grants? And we use the state-by-state data on how many providers said they would have closed were it not for these grants. So as a result of that, we do believe that this will take time, right? That this could be about a year before we really see this impact. And again, that is, if no action is taken, right? We don't know, like in the states that have taken action, that hopefully will mitigate some of this impact. So there are some states, including North Carolina, where some new funds have come in, and that may really help. And again, we really expect that the first thing we'll see is higher rates and higher tuition, then staffing shortages, and then program closures as a last resort. And it could be, up to a year before we really see that impact. But hopefully we won't have to, because hopefully Congress will act before the end of the year.
Another question is one that I'm actually thinking about right now too, from Lena Ruiz, from the Fort Worth Star Telegram, asks, do you think a mixed system of private providers and public schools offering early childhood education is the best route? Are we seeing instances of private providers going out of business because their local school district has expanded into early childhood? Either one of you can answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I think it is absolutely the right way to go. But we need that mixed delivery system, as we call it, where there's a mix of private providers. I'll go back to something I said before. What you want for your 2-month-old, your 15-month-old, and your 4-year-old can look really, really different, right? There are different providers, different options, those kinds of choices is critically important. Families have different needs. There is both a care and an education part to this, and that can be delivered in a variety of settings, right? I again said children and babies are learning everywhere and in the context of relationships. So there isn't like one particular setting that is sort of cornered quality and it said that is like the best place where that learning happens. That said, we know a lot of things about it needs to be resourced in terms of the person doing the care, their own well-being, those supports, etc. And we don't see that across the board, and that's where you can see some of the differences. Specifically to the point about under enrollment in one place or another, that happens, but that happens because of the way we've set up the system and the policies and where we've driven resources, how we have created funding in silos, right, between federal, state, and federal, national level, and local policies. And so I think we're seeing a lot more happening locally and at the state level in terms of trying to bring, create the kind of infrastructure in communities to prevent those kinds of unfortunate realities from happening, right? When one particular funding stream is directed, say, through public schools only, that can create challenges in terms of under enrollment in another part of the system, especially if it's directed at, say, just 4-year-olds or, just 3 and 4-year-olds, et cetera. And that looks like, coordinating on, how children and families are enrolled, et cetera. So I won't get too detailed in the interest of time, but that is, I think that the emphasis is on there is build a system, have infrastructure, have partnerships, think about together across these different settings, how the workforce is supported, try to address these inequities that we see as best we can. But we've got a lot of work to do, but that shouldn't, take us away from what the end goal is. And I think the end goal is to really be able to build a system that can create hold a lot of diversity in terms of options and supports for families, and where quality is evenly supported in all of those environments.
Julie, did you have anything to add to that about instances of private providers going out of business because of their local school district, expanding into early childhood, or
No,
anything else?
just I agree. Mixed delivery makes sense, right? We want a variety of options that make communities comfortable, families comfortable, so it's the best fit for them, especially when we're talking about those early years. And I think it's one of the really important reasons that we have to prioritize infants and toddlers, right? So oftentimes what'll happen is we'll say, great, we're going to do preschool for 4-year-olds, right? And then infants and toddlers get left behind, and that really does crowd them out because the teachers, I think Miriam was alluding to this, right? Like the teachers go do the preschool because they can make more money there. So we lose teachers. And then, the older kids are less expensive to serve because you need high ratios of adults to young children, right? And so really making sure that if you're going to invest in pre-K for 4-year-olds, that you are absolutely investing in infants and toddlers too, and recognizing the higher expense of doing so, I think is really important.
All right, we have a few more questions. And if maybe you could just give a few examples. This one's for Miriam, from Emily Tate Sullivan from EdSurge. Says Miriam mentioned innovations emerging in the aftermath of these funds expiring. What have Julie and Miriam seen or heard to that effect? In what ways are people and programs getting creative? If you could just give 1 or 2 examples each, maybe.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing a lot in locally in terms of really focusing on supply building, right? Well, really digging in and trying to understand locally what are the ways in which we can help providers expand businesses, open new business, open new businesses, for in childcare, whether that looks like getting more supports financially, business training, startup costs, thinking about building networks where maybe costs can be shared, and creating some like infrastructure and efficiencies to be able to do that. Innovations around how networks of providers, for example, could get benefits like healthcare, insurance, retirement, pooled retirement, or insurance that they need for businesses at lower cost. So just a lot of things very locally that I think are really interesting that are solving problems. Other examples like barriers that we might see in regulation. And I want to be really clear though, not barriers like blanket deregulate on areas that matter for health and safety, right? But areas where, things that have needed to be looked at maybe for a long time, right? Because they haven't had really a provider lens of like, hey, we haven't really made this easy or efficient enough or supported enough providers to be able to navigate this. And we're, really getting really creative minds and being able to think about that. And then, I think we've seen a lot in terms of funding innovation in terms of also wages and benefits and how states are reaching providers and new providers, and being able to really wrestle with how are we going to, do something about increasing salaries that I'm super excited about. So there's, a lot to build on.
Washington, D.C., tax on wealthy taxpayers to pay for higher wages. Innovative, important, very, incredible. Massachusetts, money for stabilization grants. I think they call it foundation grants, the Commonwealth Cares for Children grants program, right? Childcare providers, right? That's another specific one. And then I'll just throw out Washington State paying for health insurance for childcare providers. 3 of the things that we've seen that shouldn't be innovative, but sadly it is.
Yeah. I should mention, access to training and work for, opportunities to get advanced in credentials degrees. North Seattle Community College is working on, has already, or is about to launch a bachelor's degree in early childhood education, applied bachelor's degree entirely in Spanish, right, to be able to support the workforce. So good stuff happening.
Yeah, and I know we're almost at time, but was wondering if Miriam or Julie, would you be able to go over maybe 5 minutes because we have 2 more questions that okay, great. Okay, so this question comes from Natalie Pate from Oregon Public Broadcasting. Natalie asks, what unique challenges are you seeing/expecting due to the cliff for rural areas? Families who need cultural or language supports, or folks who need non-traditional hours, nights, weekends, holidays. Also, we're seeing a growing effort in Oregon to unionize childcare workers. Are you seeing that in other parts of the country? So there's two questions there. One about people in rural areas, people who need supports, and then also a question about unionizing for childcare workers.
Take it first. Just number one, like, yes, right? Like, you sound like someone who has been covering this issue for a while, because those are clearly the issues that are the hardest, right? That, rural areas. There was a provider in Maine who'd been serving 100 families, and she just closed down. It was a rural area in Maine, and those families have no other options. There's just, what ends up happening is folks have to travel really far, which really eats into their time with their families and their work day. Or they piecemeal it together, and that creates instability for their child, as well as for their ability to show up for work and be there, the productive employee they want to be. And so it's really challenging in those areas. And I think a high priority, as well as culturally, sensitive and thoughtful options for families as well. We need more support around. And sometimes family childcare can really be that, home-based childcare. And we know that is the area of the sector that is struggling more, that while the trend in declining family childcare has slowed as a result of the stabilization funding, it hasn't stopped. So that means we're still losing family childcare programs, which A, are good for rural areas, B, can be good for, culturally competent care. And so, all of this is to say, we still need the big investments that we would have gotten in Build Back Better, right? So Build Back Better, the House of Representatives actually passed comprehensive childcare and early learning, right, funding that would have made a huge difference and been a game changer. And that is still part of the fight, right? We need to address the emergency situation today, and then we need to really build for the long term.
And then I don't know if Miriam, you had anything to add to that, but for the question about unionizing child workers, is that something they're seeing in other parts of the country?
Julie, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Just to say, California has been working on that for a very long time, and they just this last year were able to come to agreement and negotiate their contract. And so providers in California are going to be seeing higher wages. At the same time, advocates for parents were able to negotiate fee decreases. And so this is really exciting, where we're going to be doing all the things, right? We're going to pay people better and make it more affordable for families. And we're able to do that by putting more public dollars into the system. So California is a great model to look at for that.
Yeah, I would just add, hi, Natalie. It's great to see somebody from OPB here. I think that, just to build on what Julie said, I think really in particular looking at, I think, family, friend, and neighbor care as well, specifically is an area where, I feel like we did some important things in Oregon, and, just to connect to the dots with the union question, we had some of our family, friend, and neighbor care givers who were represented, and that they were, the union was a really, really important partner. And I think there was a strong, relationship between what we were able to do for those that the family, friend, and neighbor caregivers that accepted, participated in our child care subsidy program in the state, and how they were, reimbursed, and some of the supports that we were able to provide. At the same time, I think we need to do more. And I think that's a trend we see nationally, is that our systems often aren't really touching those caregivers. Most family, friend, and neighbor care is unpaid care. And it is also the type of care that is most prevalent for infants and toddlers, right? And so it is care that needs to be supported. Those caregivers need a lot more support. And when you think as well around, care during non-traditional hours, maybe somebody that would be in your home or would be in a home and provide really a lot of that one-to-one attention and things like that. It's really, really, I think, important part of the solution. Not the only answer, but I think an important part of it. Yeah, I think, when we look to see where we have made a lot of progress to date, just to build also on what Julie said around efforts around wages and benefits, again, to my comment earlier, I think we see that, efforts to, really unionize and with our labor partners have been an important part of that story.
So we have one last question from Kati Coco, or Kathy Coco. I apologize, Kathy, if I'm saying your name wrong. From the Palm Beach Post in South Florida, asks, what types of questions would you be asking to specifically providers for ELL or immigrant students and their families?
Great. So let me see. Thinking about what providers and what kinds of questions to ask. Yeah. I'll think about, I'll sort of think about this question in a couple of different ways. One is that the providers who speak languages other than English, or, don't speak English well or not at all, can face a number of challenges in our system. One of the systems that impacts providers far and wide in states is the licensing system. So, how to get a license, how to get the training to become licensed as a provider in states is one that often, really requires a level of English language proficiency. And many states are in different places in terms of how supportive they are in the language access provisions that are there. And that is really important because that's the entry point to a lot of these other supports. Right, that's how the system begins to know about you, right, and can open up other opportunities, often around how to participate and get some of these public funds that are available, or unlock other training opportunities, participate in quality initiatives. And so it is concerning to me, and it's not often the only route, but the biggest pathway right now, that we haven't really thought a lot about equity enough, I think, in licensing for providers. But beyond that, as I touched on earlier, really being able to think about how we create more opportunities to participate in professional learning experiences, get access to those, opportunities to get more access to how you learn, expand your training and child development and knowledge, and partnering with families. What is beyond what is required, at minimal levels, right, to be able to meet minimal requirements and compliance in the system, I think is really critical. And I think, so that's one aspect. We have to do a lot more to reach those providers and support them in just the basics of what we offer in our systems. The other thing, last point I'll make is, we often talk about, these, how important bilingualism is and the benefits of it. But I think we also can often talk about children who are multilingual learners at the same time as a risk factor. And so I think we have to shift some of that frame. And I think when we do that too, we'll see this workforce as well as more of an asset in the system. And so I think both things really need to shift. And so again, these are the numbers are pretty powerful when you think 1 out of 3 young children is coming from a home where English isn't the first language. And so we have to really shift that to, that's an asset, something to build upon. The research is very clear about the benefits of bilingualism and multilingualism, and really embracing that and thinking about the opportunity we have in these earliest years because we have such a linguistically and culturally diverse workforce is a great opportunity, and the diversity that we have with kids and families. And so how do we actually start to shift our whole frame in supporting them, supporting that to happen in these caregiving arrangements, and hopefully that can push up and extend into the K-12 system, I think is where we see a lot of that, often sometimes pushed down as sort of like a risk factor, right? Because if you're not pretty proficient in English, that's where, we know the most of the language of instruction is, and that can really set you back in your learning. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah. Well, we went about 10 minutes over time. But we had a really engaged conversation. I think that's a good thing in this situation. But
Yeah.
we're gonna wrap up now. I would like to thank you both, Miriam and Julie, again for joining us today to share your expert insights. And finally, I would also like to thank everyone who came to this webinar for engaging with us on this important conversation. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and remember to complete the post-webinar survey that's going to be posted in the chat soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.